It is such an honor to be called by God, to be singled out or chosen to do something for Him because God is great, which means anything that you do for God is great. So it makes you great. And that's something that we should always value. Sometimes when you're working for the Lord, it can be taxing, it can be difficult, and we start to get frustrated and we see how difficult it is, and we neglect to always remember what a great thing it is to have the call of God on your life. When you're called by God, in order to answer it, sometimes it requires walking away from everything that's familiar to you. Sometimes it just does not make sense. But faith does not always make sense. When God calls you, He will certify you. He will qualify you. He will approve you. He'll go before you and He'll make a way. So when we are called by God, we can't look around at circumstances. We can't look at people. We've got to stay focused on God and remain faithful to answer the call. As always, it is so good to have you here to join me for the Sanctuary Sunday School. And I just want to remind you that we do have the virtual vacation Bible School June 1st through August 30th. So you can get information about that at www.thesanctuary.academy. This week's subject is Abram, called by God. Now, this is a new unit that we're starting in June. And we just left the unit where we were going through the epistles, the Pauline epistles. And you see throughout those epistles, Paul referenced Abraham. And so it's good to go back to this story because now we're actually going back to the scriptures and the account of the things that actually happened that they referenced throughout the New Testament. So we see here Abram called by God. His name was Abram, and this was before his name was changed to Abraham. So we have Abram here, and he was living in Haran with his father Terah. Now he was there. His entire family was there. And at the age of 205 years old, Abram's father died. And at that point, God spoke to Abram and He told him, it's time for you to go. And He said, you're going to leave your country. You're going to leave your kindred. You're going to leave your father's house, and you're going to go to this land that I'm going to show you. Now, I want to just stop and elaborate on that for a minute because that's quite a command. Think about that. It's out of time. He was there and he's in this land with his father, and his father had passed away. So inevitably, he had something coming. This was his land. This is what was going on. This is what he knew, where he grew up, everything that he knew, everything that was familiar. And this is why he is referred to as the father of the faithful, because for Abram to just up and leave at the call of God required so much faith. And as we know, he turned out to be one of the greatest men in the Bible. And so he left and he did exactly what God told him to do. And that's such a lesson to us. When God tells you to do something, you have to do what God tells you to do. He didn't tell you to figure it out. He didn't tell you to try to make sure it's going to work. He didn't tell you to verify by anybody else. He said to obey Him. And that's what you have to do. So this is what he did. And then when he did this, God made a promise to him. And we have three parts of the promise here. It says, first of all, I'm going to make you a great nation. And then He says, I'm going to make your name great. And then He told him that you're going to be a blessing. And when we study the Old Testament at this point in time, it's always encouraging and uplifting for me. Because as we know, God has already done these things. See, consider Abram. He's listening to God and he obeyed God and followed and answered the call based on a promise. But now we're here in 2019 and we know that God has kept this promise to Abram. So now we have no excuse not to answer the call of God. And sometimes when you're called and you're out here and you're trying to minister or whatever it is that you're called to do, the enemy is attacking and it gets difficult and he wants to discourage you. But see, I can go back to this scripture. And I can see these blessings that God promised to Abram. And I know that God kept his promise. And see, I know that God is just. So if he kept this promise to Abram, he's going to keep the promise to me. And then he told him, he said, listen to this. He said, I'm going to bless them that bless you. And then he said, I'm going to curse them that curse you. And that says to me that God is always with me. And I've said this before. If you're called to an assignment by God, you have to focus on that assignment. You don't have time to address everyone who criticizes you. You don't have time to argue with everyone who challenges you, because God said he's going to bless them that bless you and curse them that curse you. So he's going to handle them before they can stop you. And just think about that. Let that sink in. If God has called you, there is no force on earth that can stop you. Now look at this promise that God made to Abram. And let's go through and think about all of the things that they went through in the Old Testament. When we talk about being in Egypt and being slaves, and we talk about the carrying away of Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, all of these things, talk about the Philistines that just literally taunted them throughout the entire Old Testament. None of these things could prevent God from keeping his promise. And Israel, Abraham's people, they were not known to be warriors. They were a religious people. So being fighters was not what they were known for, but they emerged victorious, and God kept this promise through them. And we just got through in the past unit, we talked about Jesus Christ. See, the whole purpose of this promise was to bring Jesus through this lineage of Abraham, who was his name after it was changed from Abram. So God did that, and he did not allow anything to stop that promise. So when we look at that and we know that, that's where our faith comes from. That's where we get the encouragement to step out and be bold and answer the call of God. So we see here that Abram and his family and his nephew Lot and his family, they left and they headed to Canaan. And Canaan is the land that God promised to Abram. And we see here that Abram went to this place, and he went just outside of Canaan, and he pitched a tent and he worshiped the Lord. He built an altar. And this also addresses some of the things that we covered in the previous unit, where they were struggling with the law and with righteousness. And this shows you right here, this is at the call of Abram. Before he even became Abraham, before there was a people, a whole people, before there was a law, Abram worshiped God, and he was faithful. And this promise to Abraham that God made was based on his faith. And so this actually supports the New Testament, where it talks about being justified by faith. And sometimes people will say that the Old Testament and the New Testament contradict each other, and they absolutely do not. As a matter of fact, the New Testament bears out the Old Testament. It fulfills the prophecies of the Old Testament. And like I said, so this is showing you right here, it's completely consistent to what we were teaching from Paul last month, when he was talking about the justification and the righteousness being found in the faith. And we see here that it's Abram's faith that brought these blessings upon him and upon future generations to come. And he promised this land to Abram, and he said that your seed is going to inherit this land. And another lesson that I found right in there is how we can bless our seed through our faith. I was young and now I'm old. I've never seen the righteous forsaken or his seed begging bread. When we are righteous, when we are faithful, God promised to bless our seed. Because remember, we talked about this a few weeks ago when Paul was teaching how we are heirs with Christ, and how the blessing of Abraham we have as well, because we're grafted into the family. So this blessing that I'm speaking of, that God promised to Abram, we have access to it. So we have the ability, just like Abraham or Abram blessed his seed through his faith, we have a responsibility to do the same thing. And we're living in a day where it's extremely difficult to raise children because societal standards have plummeted. to a point where anything goes. You can teach your child one thing and they can go to school and their teacher will tell them something else. They can go to a family member's house and that family member is going to tell them something else. They can even go to a church and a church is going to tell them something else. So as a parent, you're standing there and you're standing in the gap and you're fighting this battle and you're teaching and you're trying to make sure that your seed is blessed like Abram's seed was blessed. You're trying to hand down that blessing of Abraham. And what this says to me is if you're faithful, when it looks like they're going to fail, when it looks like they're not listening, when it feels like they're not going to make it, you have this promise and you have this call of God in your life and you can stand on the promises of God. We want to be like Abram. Abram was called by God and he had enough faith to get up and go, to act on his calling. And we have the same charge. You don't have to be called to be a preacher or a missionary or a bishop, whatever it is that God has called you to do. Find yourself answering the call of God.